Just before dawn on July 17, 2020, Dan Acquah, under the light of his headlamp, prepared his first pitch at the base of the Aiguille Noire de Pouterre. This challenging climb marked the beginning of the Pouterre Intégrale, a renowned ridge climb. Over the next 3 days, they would face rock climbing, ice climbing, rappelling, and alpine hiking, all the way to the summit of Mont Blanc. At 54, Dan was older than most who attempted this infamous route, but age was no deterrent for him. He believed in seizing every moment, not dwelling on regrets later in life. He never wanted to be the one wishing he had done something when he had the chance. A seasoned firefighter in London, Dan was no stranger to risk. He understood that mitigating danger, whether battling a blaze or navigating treacherous mountains, involved surrounding himself with the right people. That's where his climbing partner, 38-year-old Matt Tomlinson, came in. Described as polar opposites, Dan, a self-proclaimed grumpy old git, found himself drawn to Matt's outgoing and positive personality. Despite their differences, they shared a deep passion for climbing, a bond forged at their local gym. Over the years, they'd tackled climbs across the globe, though Dan readily admitted he wasn't the most graceful mountaineer. Matt, on the other hand, seemed to improve with each expedition, surpassing Dan in both strength and skill. Their journey, however, hit a snag in early 2020. The pandemic struck, forcing Matt, a sound engineer, out of work and confined to his home. Dan, as a firefighter, continued his work, but they both yearned for the mountains. As restrictions eased, they began training together, using Matt's loft gym. The possibility of a climb in the Alps rekindled their hope. Where better to mark their return than Mont Blanc? Dawn broke on July 17th, revealing the imposing southern face of the Aiguille Noire, their first major hurdle. Both climbers were eager to begin, driven by the knowledge that the weather forecast offered only a brief window of opportunity, 4 or 5 days at most, before a storm swept in. Their original plan involved acclimatization climbs, allowing their bodies to adjust to the thinner air at high altitudes. However, the approaching storm forced them into a difficult decision: delay and risk missing the window, or press on and hope for the best. Opting for a calculated risk, they set off, their headlamps illuminating the path up the Aiguille Noire. Dan had climbed this section before, but something felt different this time. The weight of his pack and the thin air made him wheeze more than usual. Despite the initial concern, he remained confident that his body would adapt, just like it always had. The first rays of dawn painted the sky as they picked their way up the vertical rock face. They continued climbing through the afternoon, their focus unwavering. However, as the shadows stretched across the mountain range, they realized they were significantly behind schedule. The first day, they only made it halfway up the Aiguille Noire, whereas most climbers reach the Cravarie Bivouac, which is not only at the summit, but also involves rappelling down the other side to the Col dei Biancani. Despite the setback, they remained optimistic. The storm wasn't due for another 4 days. As long as they acclimatized quickly, they could make up for lost time. They unfurled their bivy bags and settled in for a night under the stars. The next day, they reached the summit of the Aiguille Noire, slower than other climbers who had just begun their ascent. By late afternoon, instead of rappelling down the notoriously dangerous Brescia du Col, a place infamous for rockfall, Dan suggested stopping for the day. Together, they made a calculated decision. Staying put would keep them safe from falling rocks, but it would also set them back several hours. The following morning, they were filled with regret. After rappelling down, they discovered a safe campsite at the bottom that they had missed the previous day. The delays were mounting, and their pace remained slow. As they progressed along the knife-edge ridge of the Pouterre Intégrale, they stopped to take in the breathtaking view. The jagged path stretched from the summit of Mont Blanc down to the valley floor, carpeted with wildflowers visible through the midday haze. Beyond, the majestic peaks of the Alps faded into the distance, forming a ribbon of white against the azure sky. Turning, Dan fixed his gaze on the summit, shrouded in mist, the peak of Mont Blanc standing guard over them. However, as the third day wore on, their goal seemed further and further away. Their primary source of hydration, the melted snow, was turning out to be a health hazard. As a consequence of the heavy traffic on this popular route during peak season, climbers often left waste behind, contaminating the snow. By the end of the second day, they were both suffering from diarrhea. Dehydrated instead of acclimatizing, they weren't climbing well at all. The climb had become a grueling struggle. Their next challenge, the Aiguille Blanche, the snowier and bulkier cousin of the Aiguille Noire, loomed ahead. As they neared the final 1,000 meters, the temperature plummeted. A harsh wind howled through the valley, and the rock face rose before them like a frozen wave. Shivering, Dan and Matt gritted their teeth and began their ascent, a slow and determined struggle upwards. The sun dipped below the horizon, cloaking the Alps in sudden darkness. Dan and Matt flicked on their headlamps and continued their arduous climb. They couldn't afford to stop. Reaching the summit, Matt let out a cry that could only be described as despair. Dan approached his partner, only to find them gazing at a seemingly impassable chasm separating them from the snow slope leading to the true peak of the Aiguille Blanche de Pouterie. The darkness made it impossible to discern the true layout. With a storm looming not for the next day but for the following morning, panic set in. They feared they were on the wrong mountain entirely. Exhausted and dehydrated, they set up camp with heavy hearts, forced to wait until dawn for any hope of finding a solution. The first light of day brought a wave of relief. They were on the correct route after all. The chasm was an illusion caused by the darkness. The path ahead, though challenging, was clear. Buoyed by their newfound clarity and clear skies, they set off, determined to reach the summit that day. They envisioned a leisurely descent to the first alpine hut and a celebratory beer. But their progress remained sluggish. After rappelling down a snow-filled gully, they trekked towards the final rock face. As they trudged across the snowfield, the warm sun beat down on Dan's neck. He realized the snow they were traversing had been exposed to direct sunlight all morning. He knew the dangers of crevasses, hidden cracks masked by snow bridges that could easily give way. Crossing them was often technical and potentially deadly. Dan cautiously approached the suspected crevasse called the Bergstrand, hoping for a stable snow bridge. He nervously tiptoed across, placing a protective cam device in a crack in the rock as a safety measure. Just as he thought he was safe, the snow bridge beneath him gave way. For a terrifying second, Dan plummeted. The rope around his waist yanked him up abruptly, his body slamming against the icy wall of the crevasse with a sickening thud. Dazed and shaken, Dan managed to pull himself back up onto the surface. He collapsed, his head throbbing from the impact, though seemingly unharmed otherwise. Matt rushed to his side. He didn't seem to be injured from the fall itself, but he was a little dizzy from the blow to the head. Regaining his footing, Dan followed Matt, their movements cautious as they neared the base of the escarpment. However, as they started climbing the rock face, a strange feeling crept over Dan. A thick fog seemed to have settled in his brain. It started with confusion, whether from fatigue, dehydration, or altitude sickness, perhaps all of them combined. They were still several hundred meters below the summit, with the weather worsening and their supplies dwindling. As dusk cloaked the mountain, Dan's struggles intensified. His balance was off, his head spinning. By the time they finally reached the top of the cliff, it was well past midnight. The summit of Mont Blanc lay just ahead, accessible only by a final steep slope. But Dan's physical state had deteriorated further. He was hit with a bout of diarrhea, another symptom of their severe dehydration. It was now 4 in the morning. For nearly 24 hours, Dan and Matt had been pushing themselves to their limits. A fierce gust of wind howled, sending icy shards clinking against their helmets. The storm had arrived. They were still near the base of the final slope leading to the summit. Their only option was the valet hut, an emergency shelter located 500 meters down on the other side of the mountain. Remaining calm and moving carefully was crucial. Fueled by a desperate need to reach the ridge and get to safety, Dan began scrambling up the icy slope, his crampons slipping intermittently. Matt struggled to keep pace. The combination of concussion, altitude sickness, exhaustion, and dehydration had formed a perfect storm of confusion, heightened by the real storm raging around them. The first rays of dawn painted the summit of Mont Blanc in a bleak gray light. It should have been a moment of triumph, a culmination of their arduous journey. Instead, it was a scene of despair, shrouded in a thick fog of sleet and buffeted by fierce winds. Battered by the elements, Dan stumbled blindly through the snow towards the summit ridge. Matt, connected to him by a taut rope, struggled to keep up as Dan lurched forward. Then, without warning, Dan's world went black. He had passed out. Regaining consciousness slowly, Dan found himself disoriented, the frigid air biting at his face. He saw only a wall of ice seemingly stretching for miles, culminating in a faint crack of light. He had fallen into a crevasse. He vaguely remembered dangling from his harness, followed by the sound of Matt's scream. Matt, anchored to the summit ridge with his ice axe, was holding his weight. It was a precarious situation, the ice threatening to give way at any moment. Despite his exhaustion, Dan's body seemed to take over. With one ice axe and 2 crampons, he blindly swung and kicked his way up the crevasse wall, inch by grueling inch. Somehow, he managed to climb out. Then, he blacked out again. After regaining some consciousness, he found himself nestled in a makeshift snow hole dug by Matt just below the ridgeline. Matt had managed to contact mountain rescue, but with the ever-present threat of hypothermia, every minute was crucial. Matt bundled Dan up in his down jacket and a thermal blanket, doing everything he could to keep him warm while he waited for the arrival of the mountain rescue team. Dan, aware of the potential gravity of his situation, was overcome by despair. He couldn't feel his legs and believed he wouldn't survive. He yearned only to see his wife again. As he drifted in and out of consciousness, fear and resignation took turns consuming him. 6 agonizing hours passed. It was mid-afternoon. Thick gray mist choked the summit as distant peals of thunder rolled through the valley. The storm raged on, and the rescue team remained unseen. Dan's internal conflict mirrored the storm's fury. One moment he'd wish Matt to leave him, the next he'd wake up in a panic, convinced he was alone and needed to descend despite his paralyzed legs. With each passing minute, a grim conclusion became more undeniable. For Matt's survival, leaving Dan behind might be the only option. Unknown to Dan, the rescue team, struggling their way up the treacherous mountain, maintained intermittent phone contact with Matt, conveying the same agonizing proposition. Around 6 p.m., Dan shivered beneath his thin blanket, his head resting on the snow, barely registering the howling wind and relentless snowfall. Yet a new sound gradually pierced his haze. Voices, multiple voices. Then he saw Matt talking to Fred, the leader of the rescue team. They were discussing something, and the next thing he knew, he was being moved. Strong arms lifted him from the snow hole. Relief was beyond his grasp. He blinked up at the burly rescuers who strapped an oxygen mask over his face and administered a dose of steroids. Slowly, energy seeped back into his limbs, though he remained unable to stand. After half an hour of oxygen and steroids, Dan thought he could move his legs. He tried to stand, but he was told to lie back down. He understood. Moving in this weather, especially without a stretcher and a helicopter out of the question, was a dangerous gamble. Clarity also began to return. Dan understood the predicament. Descending the mountain while carrying him was impossible in the worsening weather, and a helicopter landing was out of the question. As he gathered his strength, he overheard a heated discussion between Matt and the rescuers. They were going to leave him. The storm was intensifying, wind was whipping, and lightning was imminent. They were on the verge of leaving him behind. They dug a hole, attempting to make him comfortable, preparing to abandon him on the mountain while rescuing Matt. Matt, clearly distressed, shook his head as someone pointed at their watches. Leaving Dan never crossed Matt's mind. He would have died too. Staying meant certain death. They would have had to physically force him to leave. The gravity of the situation hung heavy in the air. It was up to Dan, now or never. He gritted his teeth, mustering the last remnants of his strength. A primal instinct, an unidentifiable force, propelled him forward. He had already mentally accepted his fate. Anything beyond that was a bonus. In an unexpected turn of events, strength surged back into Dan's legs. With remarkable speed, the rescuers decided to get him on his feet. They got him up and helped him over the ridge. They tied him to two other guys and literally ran him and Matt down the mountain to the valet shelter, which is located above the summit of Mont Blanc. This descent took place amidst the full fury of the storm. The wind was horrific. Dan was basically a passenger, kept falling over. The rescuers expertly navigated the treacherous terrain at high altitude, dodging lightning strikes that cracked just meters above them. Stumbling through the door of the valet emergency shelter, the climbers found little respite. Dan's blood oxygen levels needed immediate regulation, or his heart could fail. Unfortunately, the shelter's bariatric chamber, designed for such situations, was malfunctioning. Rescuers tried to fix a crack in the chamber's plastic shell with duct tape, but it was to no avail. This meant Dan couldn't be stabilized there, forcing them to descend further down the mountain. An hour later, they burst through the doors of another lower-altitude hut. Exhausted and battered, Dan and Matt were finally wrapped in woolen blankets and rehydrated. Slowly, the storm subsided, leaving them safe and recovering. On July 22nd, 5 days after their ascent began, Dan and Matt were taken to the hospital in Chamonix. Severe dehydration, potential kidney failure, concussion, and altitude sickness. A combination of all three is what caused Dan to shut down on the summit. Facing near-certain death, Dan was rescued in a daring high-altitude operation, the highest ever recorded by the rescue team. The true gravity of his situation hit Dan later. His abandoned backpack, retrieved after the storm, was reduced to ashes by a lightning strike. They were on the verge of leaving him behind. If he hadn't walked, he would have been left behind. Among the many factors that had brought him back from the brink, Matt's unwavering loyalty stood out. Despite being instructed to abandon Dan, he refused, demonstrating an unyielding commitment that ultimately saved his life. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to check out the other great content on our channel. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more. Thank you again, and see you in the next video.